boys and girls. I have a fun story to read to you today. We've been learning a little bit about frogs and their life cycle, and we've been learning about toads. They're very similar to frogs, but a little bit different. And this story is not a real story. It's a funny, pretend made-up story. It's about a frog and a toad who are friends. The Adventures of Frog and Toad. This is a big book with lots of little stories in it. So I'm not going to read all of them to you today because that would take a long time. But I'm going to read you one today called A Lost Button. Toad and Frog went for a long walk. They walked across a large meadow. They walked in the woods. They walked along the river. At last, they went back home to Toad's house. "Oh, drat," said Toad. "Not only do my feet hurt, but I have lost one of the buttons on my jacket." "Aw, don't worry," said Frog. "We will go back to all the places where we walked, and we will soon find your button." They walked back to the large meadow. They began to look for the button in the tall grass. "Here is your button," cried Frog. "That is not my button," said Toad. "That button is black. My button was white." Toad put the black button in his pocket. A sparrow flew down. "Excuse me," said the sparrow. "Did you lose a button?" I found one." "That is not my button," said Frog. "That button has 2 holes. My button had 4 holes." Toad put the button with 2 holes in his pocket. They went back to the woods and looked on the dark paths. "Here's your button," said Frog. "That is not my button," said Toad. "That button is small. My button was big." Toad put the small button in his pocket. They are finding lots of buttons, but they aren't Toad's button. A raccoon came out from behind a tree. "I heard that you were looking for a button," he said. "Here is one that I just found." "That is not my button," wailed Toad. "That button is a square. My button was round." Toad put the square button in his pocket. Frog and Toad went back to the river. They looked for the button in the mud. "Here's your button," cried Frog. "That is not my button," shouted Toad. "That button is thin. My button was thick." Toad put the thin button in his pocket. He was very angry. He jumped up and down and screamed, "The whole world is covered with buttons, and not one of them is mine." Toad ran home and slammed the door. There on the floor, he saw his white, 4-holed, big, round, thick button. "Oh," said Toad, "it was here all the time. What a lot of trouble I have made for Frog." Toad took all of the buttons out of his pocket. He took his sewing box down from his shelf. Toad sewed the buttons all over his jacket. The next day, Toad gave his jacket to Frog. Frog thought that it was beautiful. He put it on and jumped for joy. None of the buttons fell off. Toad had sewed them on very well. The end. I hope you enjoyed that. That was a very fun story.